start.
Okay.
Okay. I see folks are starting to log in. And so
How many have we got so far?
so far we're at 10, 12, 14, 16. So we're jumping up. So maybe
And I have the chat open if people would prefer to do that.
okay. I do have, I don't know if it shows at the bottom, Temple, a Q&A option. Do you see that on yours? I was thinking we could save Q&As until the end. I'll read some questions to you.
Yeah, that's okay. We can do that. But I have a very short presentation. Again, I can go into why I did this paper.
Okay.
Why is somebody working slaughterhouses writing a paper about grazing?
Okay.
I'll start out with that.
All right. Well, maybe I'll go ahead and introduce you. And so that
Okay. All right, we can get started.
Yeah. Real quick, I know when we speak casually, I would just call you Temple, but do you prefer Dr. Grandin in this capacity?
Well, you can use Temple Grandin, it's fine.
Okay.
And just say I'm a professor of animal science at Colorado State University.
Okay. All right. We will get started. Okay. Good morning, everyone. Thank you so much for being here today. This is a recorded conversation. So just letting you know that in case you're not comfortable that we are recording today, and it will be available to view later on YouTube. Such an honor to have Dr. Temple Grandin with us today, Professor of Animal Sciences at Colorado State University. Temple, thank you for being here.
Well, it's great to be here. And you probably have seen my paper, Grazing Cattle, Sheep, and Goats is part of a sustainable agricultural future. Oh, let's put bison in there too, all the grazing animals.
Yes, absolutely.
And why did I write this paper? I've been in the cattle industry for 50 years, and I'm concerned that people are just saying grazing animals are terrible and we ought to just get rid of them. Well, the more I learned about grazing, and grazing done right, that's not true. There's a lot of land that evolved originally with grazing, and if it's done right, it can actually improve land. So there's two ways that we can do, really good regenerative agriculture with grazing. It's with grasslands, and the other is cover crops. So a farmer puts in a cover crop, he's doing corn and soy or whatever every third year, and that cover crop should be grazed. And by doing that, you cut down on the amount of fertilizer that you have to put on it, because the cattle put, or the sheep, or whatever animal you're using is going to put fertilizer on. So that's really good. But you're going to have to do it right. It's also extremely local. Something that works in one place will not work somewhere else. I went to grazing workshop in South Dakota, and they were talking about what put in the cedar when you're seeding the pasture. Well, that's the $1 million question, and you better get really good local advice. Now, there's some consultants out there that tell you really complicated things. I was at a very nice farm in Nebraska. They raised chickens, and they were saying we need to put like these 20 different kinds of seeds. You're gonna have to mix it in a cement mixer, and the farmer's going, ah. Well, it might be a good idea to do something simple, like maybe some wheat first, something simple for the beginner.
Yeah.
Or it could be a pre-mixed seed mix that they could use, but don't lay something really complicated on a beginner. Let's deal with the methane issue. Cattle put out methane. Yes, they definitely do. But wetlands put out 1/3 of all the methane. Another thing that puts out methane is rice paddies, dumps, landfills, wastewater treatment plants. I was just reading in my chemical and engineering news about some ways to maybe capture methane off of that. Leaking oil field equipment puts out about the same amount as cattle put out. But the wetlands are the biggest source. Now, here's an interesting fact. When I did the paper on grazing, an anonymous reviewer, because journal articles have to be reviewed, gave me a very interesting reference. And I want to thank that anonymous reviewer. And I found out that before Europeans came to North American continent, the vast herds of bison put out 85%, 86% of the methane that cattle put out now, just to put it in perspective. And here are some very, very basic principles. Very, very basic. He'll ask about stocking density. You graze half the grass height, and then you get them off of it. And the roots take longer to regrow than the grass. The big mistake that's made is not giving enough regeneration time. Now, in terms of stocking density, you don't want the cattle cherry picking that pasture and eating all the chocolates and the candy and not eating the other stuff that doesn't taste so good. The celery. Yes, I'm going to pick the chocolates off the plate before I'm going to pick celery off of it. Cattle are the same way. Fred Provenza, grazing specialist, goes, eat the best and leave the rest. So you get to bunch them tightly enough that they don't cherry pick. And then once they've grazed it down to half, you move them. Now, there's been a lot of interest in virtual fencing because building a whole lot of paddocks with permanent fence is like super expensive.
Right.
And a lot of cattle, you can just use a poly wire. They can be trained to that. Easy to move, for example, on a farm field, for example. But virtual fencing, they wear a collar that's sort of like invisible fence for a dog. And they get a beep when they get near the boundary. Now, some of these virtual fence systems have been oversold. I did not like reading on a website. Get a phone app, move your cattle around. That's rubbish. I had a chance to go visit a virtual fencing operation that the Forest Service was working on here in Colorado, and you have to train the cattle to the virtual fence. And they recommend starting in a pasture they're familiar with. You put the virtual fence, and it works off of GPS, right on top of the real fence that the cattle are familiar with. And then you gradually move it. It's going to take 2 weeks to a month to train cattle. It's going to take work. It's not just buy a phone app and move cattle around. Now, I would like to see this work because I'm a big fan of rotational grazing. And this would make it so much cheaper and easier to do because building permanent fence, I hate to, what it costs here in Colorado, it's just totally, totally terrible. Now, another basic principle, this is something that people get really, really discouraged on. It takes 3 to 5 years to see benefits, like in soil health, carbon sequestration. It doesn't happen overnight. That's another thing. Now, another issue that's come up has been stress on cattle. Well, cattle can adapt to it. Well, one study where they got stress on cattle, they were using electric fences to put like 7 steers in a really small place. Well, one of the problems when you do that is that animal's always watching its backside, worried it's going to get shocked. And nobody would normally just put 7 steers in just a small place.
Sure.
But they have to be. I saw a really bad thing one time at a feed yard, and they put like 10 foot apart, like alleyways, so electric fence, and the cattle were doing weird running around because they were worried about their backside, getting zapped.
So then they're not focused on grazing. Then they're
well, that's the problem. They need to be focused on grazing.
Right.
Now, there's some systems where you bunch them really tight and you move them almost every day. Now, that's a lot of work. That's just tons and tons of work. But a lot of these systems, when the grass is growing, you're going to need to move them, every 3 or 4 days.
Right.
But they get really, really easy to move. I went and saw some very, very nice rotational grazing in the UK, which was real interesting to see. And the thing that they had, UK doesn't get very much snow. And they had to get over the mindset of cutting the grass and making hay out of it. That was a huge mindset to get over. And to leave one pasture, well, basically the grass is going to turn brown and let them eat that in the wintertime. But there's some very good things going on in the UK. Unfortunately, when some of the rotational grazing stuff first started, I'm a big believer in what Alan Savory tried to do, but he kind of oversold some jobs. And he did that when I was living in Arizona in the 70s, and some of that did not work. It was extremely arid. And the rotational grazing systems tend to work better in areas where you got more rainfall.
Okay.
Another thing that I'm really interested in with rotational grazing, and I just looked up a few papers just before it came on, is reducing wildfire risk, reducing fire risk.
Now, we were talking about that before we logged on here. And explain what you mean by that. You mean using livestock to clear flammable brush, correct?
Well, if you have 3 foot high dead grass like they had in Hawaii, it was invasive species of dead grass on an abandoned sugarcane field. And when that got on fire, it burned up that whole town in Hawaii.
Right.
Nobody's brought up that they should have grazed that land. Now, I went to Hawaii last fall. I got to see some of that grass. I didn't go to the place where it burned, but I saw some. Otherwise, it was horrible. 3-foot high, dead brown grass.
And that's forage.
It's forest. Put animals in there. Put
Right.
animals in there. Let them eat it.
Right.
And we lost 2 years ago. We lost in Denver 1,000 homes burned. Well, because our developers built them real close together, and there was rangeland across the street from the housing development. Well, they wanted au naturel. It should have been grazed. Maybe that fire could have been prevented. We lost 1,000 houses.
Do you think that seems inapproachable for a lot of folks because they envision this huge herd of cattle having to come through a grazing area as opposed to just a few goats borrowed from a backyard neighbor?
Well, you see, where the goats have been good is getting woody plants out. You bring in some goats. Now, one of the things that's been a problem is sheep people don't know how to handle goats. There has been some problems with this, and goats, you have to handle them a bit more like cattle. When you're moving them through a handling facility, small separate groups. Sheep, you can just get a big, huge mob of sheep. They will just follow. They are so easy to handle.
Yeah.
I went out on a sheep feed yard we have here, and they'd take a tame ewe and with a dog collar on it, go out in the middle of the feed yard pen and lead her up the ramp of the truck. The other sheep would just follow. Well, I don't think you're going to do that with goats, but there's some good stuff happening with that. Another area that's really, really interesting. I had a chance to go to a meeting where ranchers are cooperating with the Audubon Society, and you can get Audubon Society certified ranches, and they're doing this to improve habitat for birds.
So
this
let's
is very
talk about
interesting.
that.
And well, I just went on my phone just now, and I didn't even spell Audubon right. That's maybe I took that off of there, but I just put in Audubon Society. I put Audubon Society Grazing, 3 keywords, Audubon Society Grazing. And I don't know if you can see that on my phone or not.
Yeah.
But look at the links. I had 2 pages of websites when I used Audubon Society Grazing, 3 keywords.
And what is the approach here? How are we melding wildlife, birds, and cattle, or goats or sheep? What is the connection?
You might leave some small areas where you leave it for cover. Like in the UK, for example, you've got what they call the hedgerows.
Okay.
And I've heard like zillions of birds inside those hedgerows. You know, they make a program where you leave a little bit of land where maybe you don't graze it. But the other thing is that family ranchers can be great for conserving land. There's some very good things that ranchers are doing with stewardship. And then they get together with the Audubon Society, and you can increase the amount of different birds you have. You know, rather than saying a cattle ranch is just, you know, a villain, you know, well-managed cattle ranch, you can get more diversity of birds and habitat. And when I went to that conference, I was really surprised about that. But now, just right now, I typed into my phone Audubon Society and grazing, 3 keywords, and there's just a ton of websites coming up on that.
That's interesting.
And that's really a good thing. Another place I'd like to see grazing is underneath solar panels. Absolutely. It just makes me sick when I see solar panels put on a field too close together, too low, so I can't graze anything under them. They need to be spaced out a little bit. Also, even with sheep, you have to put that bottom edge of the slanted panel has to be far enough off the ground that sheep can't rub on it, because they will break solar panels. I just talked to a guy where one of his sheep jumped into the middle of a solar panel and it busted it. And for cattle, you'd want to mount them about 12-foot high, put space in between them, and then you can graze under the solar panels instead of just having all that land. We've got acres and acres of solar panels right now outside of Pueblo, Colorado. I just saw the power plant, the coal-fired power plant's being ripped down. I just saw it just the other day, partly smashed up. And they put these panels in on these awful contracts where they say to the rancher, well, don't come inside the fence for 25 years, we own it. And then 25 years later, okay, now you've got a whole bunch of land full of solar panels. They're now yours to deal with. They're very bad contracts, some of them. I've talked to ranchers that have been approached.
So would you say for rotational grazing for small scale homesteaders and farmers, in permaculture, we have this saying about using the margins. It's not necessarily just about sticking your animals in a field and dividing it up. You can use maybe unconventional grazing spaces to capitalize essentially on free or excess forage while land clearing, attracting birds, reducing fire hazards. You're actually using the animal and grazing it in areas that you might not otherwise traditionally think of.
Well, that's right. I go in a lot of other countries, they graze the highway right-of-ways. Now, those are really, really tame cattle. They're tied up. They have like a halter and they're tied with a rope.
Okay.
Now, the problem we got here is they get on the road, the lawsuit situation in some of the states would be so bad, especially with cattle. Because hit cattle really fast in the car. They come through the windshield and then somebody dies or gets very, very badly hurt. Sheep wrecks a car. They don't go through the windshield.
Sure.
Now, some states are free range. And if you're a free range state, you hit the cattle, okay, you eat the damage on the car. Free range state. But other states are not free range. And you hit cattle that have gotten out, you're liable for it. And that can be an expensive mess.
So if someone wanted to get started, let's just talk about traditional rotational grazing for a second. Say you have a farming or a homesteading family, maybe just, 10, 20 acres, maybe less, and they're interested in setting up a rotational grazing system. You talked about the necessity of this. Say they're interested. How do they get started?
I would recommend going to the local county extension office when they'll have good local materials, finding out who else is doing it successfully, and go visit those people.
Because local advice.
It's local. You've got to get good local advice. So I'd go visit people. Now, a really good magazine to get is the Grassland Stockman Grass Farmer. Are you familiar with that?
Yes.
Yeah, I can go run and get a copy and show it. I would strongly recommend subscribing to the Stockman Grass Farmer. Would you like me to run and get it?
Sure, if you want to.
All right, I'll just run and get it real fast.
Okay. And while Temple is running her quick errand, we are going to have a short Q&A session at the end of this discussion today. If you look on the bottom of your Zoom screen, we're not going to use the chat box, but we're going to use the Q&A feature. So you'll type your question.
I just got a copy of the Stockman Grass Farmer, and I would recommend subscribing to this. Now, one of the problems with the Stockman Grass Farmer, none of their stuff's online in a searchable format. You don't even get the titles and get the paywall. You're going to have to subscribe to the paper version of it. And it has lots of really good articles on things that people are doing. There's a lot of articles in it by Joe Salatin, a lot of really, really good stuff. Just go ahead and subscribe to it. It's called the Stockman Grass Farmer, and they're out of Mississippi. And I think you're going to get into grazing. That's a must subscribe to. But then also, if there's local meetings, go to them. Go to your county extension. They could tell you who's doing some really good grazing stuff. But get out and see stuff. And that's so important.
Can you tell folks why that's important, or why is local advice more relevant than just looking up something online and following a random recommendation?
Well, because the plants are so local.
Right.
It's so local. You take something from Arizona, that's not going to work where you're at. It's so local. Where something like cattle handling facilities, well, and I do have a book about the small producers on cattle handling facilities, Temple Grandin's Guide to Working with Farm Animals. Well, cattle handling facilities are cattle handling facilities. And the same cattle handling facility will work in a lot of different places.
Sure.
That's not true with the rotational grazing. You've got to get that really good local advice. and get out and see stuff in your local area. Also, you can go to your state a cattle organization. You can go to beef quality assurance workshops. Those would be good places to find people that would could help you out. I'm a big believer in networking, doing some live networking. People don't want to go back into the office today. Let me tell you, there'd be no Moderna vaccine if a researcher and a doctor had not met each other in the copier room that is in the office.
Mm-hmm.
You're not going to make those kind of connections. So meeting people is just super important.
Now, but would you mind addressing, there's seems to be a misconception about rotational grazing causing parasitic or an increase in parasites between livestock. And this is interspecies grazing I'm referring to. And it's actually the opposite. Can you talk a little bit about that myth?
Well, you see, if you have killing frosts in the wintertime, that kills a lot of parasites. Also, by eating half, you're less likely to get down where the parasites are located.
Mm-hmm.
And you have a long recovery time, then parasites die. If you have a long recovery time, you see the basic principle, no matter where you're at, eat half the height of the grass, and then get them off of it until the grass is grown, but you're also going to have to dig it up and make sure the roots have regrown, because the roots take longer to regrow, because the grass is going to put its solar panels up first, because it's going to need that to build roots. So the green stuff always regenerates faster than the roots. So the mistake that gets made is grazing the going back on that piece of pasture before it's fully recovered. That's the basic mistake, and you can get away with that for a few years, but then the plant finally gives up after it's not gotten the roots regenerated. That's a very, very, very basic principle. And then the other thing is, let's say you're growing crops on a farm, is every third year you have a cover crop. I'll give you one little tip. If you do turnips, you better have them eat them small, because cattle can choke on turnips. You don't want that to happen. Animals will just eat the weirdest things. I was at our veterinary school just the other day, and they were taking foreign bodies out of dogs. And underpants are big number one, because they have the owner's scent on them. But a dog ate a pointed star-shaped sheriff's badge. I'm going, you've got to be kidding.
Sure.
Yeah.
That's going to be a high vet bill to remedy that.
Well, yes, and it showed up instantly on the x-ray.
Yeah.
They had a sheriff's badge in them. That sharp, pointy thing.
Yeah, that's not good.
Dog ate that.
So I think, you're referencing turnips, and perhaps some folks are thinking, okay, so I'm supposed to allow my livestock into my garden spaces. You're referring to forage turnips, a forageable cover.
Well, yeah, but that's right.
Yeah.
And they've choked on them. You have
Yeah.
you want to have them eat them before they get big enough for cattle to choke on. There's some people that have raised wheat, let it grow a bit, and wheat is grass fed. As long as you don't let it head out, as long as there's no grain heads on it, it's grass.
Sure.
So you put some cattle in there, let them eat half of it, and then maybe you can still get a crop of wheat. There's some people that have pulled that off.
That's interesting. So they go through they do a first cut essentially, which is when they're
they do a first cut with the cattle before it heads.
Right.
So that is still grass-fed livestock.
Interesting.
As long as it doesn't head, because it heads the grain part. They just eat the plant part, there's no grain in it.
Right.
That's still grass-fed. You're doing a grass-fed program.
Right. That's interesting.
Yeah. And you kind of do a first cutting before it heads out. And some people have been able to actually get a crop of wheat out of that. So pull the animals off. And
can I ask, is there a place where rotational grazing won't work?
There's some very, very arid places it's harder. It is harder. It isn't that it absolutely won't work, but it's a lot easier in places where plants grow quickly. That's another kind of basic principle. But even if you're in the desert, you can at least do like a 3 or 4 pasture rotation. So old-fashioned rotational grazing. Yeah, they'll do some cherry picking on it, but that's better than no rotational grazing.
Sure.
That will work. See, one of the mistakes that got made in the very beginning with Alan Savory is he came into Arizona, and I was the livestock editor for that Farm and Ranchman magazine at the time, and kind of oversold it. It's one thing I learned is never oversell something. And people built permanent fencing, very expensive paddocks, and it didn't regenerate fast enough. You're then back on the first paddock before it regenerated. New Zealand is where rotational grazing really started, but New Zealand and the UK basically have no winter. I've been there. You've got grass almost year round. So that's where rotational grazing started. But then you take the other thing we got to look at that I didn't mention is 20% of all land can only be grazed. Let's take eastern Colorado. There's a 100-mile stretch. You can go on I-70, go out the backside of the airport, head east on I-70. You go about 40 miles and the houses are gone. And there's this huge stretch of land can only be grazed. You don't have enough water for sprinklers, and you don't have enough rainfall. Sand hills of Nebraska, the same thing. Flint hills of Kansas, the same thing. That land can only be grazed. What are we going to do with that land? And there's land like that all over the world. The only way you can raise food on that land is to graze it with some kind of grazing animal.
Sure.
There's no other way.
So in those situations, because there is no rainfall and it's considered a drier area, you're going to have to go probably more land so that you are not returning the livestock to the first paddock for quite a long period of time.
That's right. Now, I understand you're in Wisconsin?
No, I used to live in Wisconsin. Now I'm in New Jersey.
You're where?
New Jersey.
New Jersey? Well, there's plenty of rain there.
Seriously.
There's and you could have to do the grazing on a really small scale, but there's plenty of rain.
What we found, I'm glad you brought this up because you mentioned the point about New Zealand and the UK not having a lot of snow in the winter.
Well, they don't have any for the most part. They don't have any.
Yeah.
And there's a very short period in both of those places. And I've been to both of those places in the wintertime of where it doesn't grow. Very, very short period of time.
We experienced that for months, right? Because we are in a winter climate. So what we
that's right. When you're in a winter climate, it's obviously not going to grow in the wintertime.
Right. So rather than trash our land by having animals turned out on it 24/7, but they also need turnout, especially horses, because they need that for colon and gut health, is we do a sacrifice plot. So they get the sacrifice area, a small part of land that's going to be trashed from the traffic because they are heavy animals on wet ground and those two don't mix, but it preserves the integrity of the other pastures, right? Because they're not.
That's right. Yeah, that's absolutely right.
Yeah, so they get what they need. We feed hay in the off season, if you will, but then for the duration of the year, we can practice rotational grazing when the weather allows.
Well, exactly. And the other thing that's come up on a lot of our ranches, on our extensive ranches, is cow size, beef cow size. Big, huge, humongous beef cows, when there's snow on the ground, take a lot more hay than smaller cows. Like an 1,100-pound cow in the wintertime doesn't eat the hay that a 1,400-pound cow will weigh. And my student, Lily Edwards, recently did a survey of 76 ranches and found that on some of the ranches, the mama cow would no longer fit in the old squeeze chute. Well, if she doesn't fit in that squeeze chute, she's probably too big. She's going to make you go broke in the wintertime. You see, the problem is that the animal that the meat plant wants, this big giant steer, has a big, huge sister that you don't really want out on these ranches. She just eats too much in the wintertime. You go out to eastern Colorado, I see grazing when I always look at the land when I drive, a lot of red Angus, the smaller. Then you go in Nebraska, and as you go east away from the sand hills, you'll see a more Angus. But I also see a lot more hay. There's also a lot of those cattle get grazed on corn stalks.
So yeah,
That's not a common thing. They graze them on in the wintertime.
that's called silage. Is that correct?
Well, it's not silage when it's in the field.
Not when it's in the field.
No, this is in the field. So they've harvested the corn, and then there's the stubble of the corn. It's probably about, that high, the stubble leftovers, and it's all dried up and brown. And there'll be a certain amount of corn grain, a little bit gets in there too. You just put them in there and let them eat it.
Which is incredibly useful, not just in clearing, but also because now you're getting fertilizer immediately delivered to the land.
Exactly. And then this will reduce the amount of artificial fertilizer, and also might help with end runoff going into places like the Gulf of Mexico.
Yeah.
And so I think what we have to be doing is integrating that, getting the crops and the animals together more.
I agree.
I think this is something we need to do. And then you get to eastern Nebraska. I mean, I've done consulting for Costco. So I've been out on a lot of, I do have to make a disclosure. Costco does pay me well. I do have to disclose anything to do with chickens. I have to disclose. Because that's the main thing I've done with Costco.
Okay.
And so you've got somebody growing rotisserie birds on a Nebraska farm. They're raising corn and soy. Now this would be a perfect place where every third year you plant a cover crop and you fertilize it with a chicken manure. And chicken manure has the advantage that it's dry. It's not a liquid, because you basically take the wood shaving bedding out of the building that's, wood chips and stuff mixed with chicken poo, and put that on the field. You see, that could be a very nice sustainable system. Well, I was out on one of those farms and they were telling us, this nice lady farmer to put mixed seed in a cement mixer. I said, come on now, we don't do that to a beginner. Let's start with something easy.
Sure.
Wheat's easy. Small grain is easy.
Sure. So
and that would make the chicken farms sustainable. And I think the thing about chicken poo is it's so much easier to work with, and it doesn't smell as bad, and it's a semi-dry material, where pig manure is a liquid.
A small scale farmer or homesteader, it would be wise for them to consider not just the species that they're bringing in. It's a closed loop system, because they need to think about the size and breed of the animal.
Yep, that's right.
How that's going to affect not only their land, but whether or not they're willing to plant or bring in forageable cover crops.
There's a lot of stuff in here.
Okay.
I strongly recommend subscribing to this. I can't even search for their articles online and hit a paywall. No, you go ahead, you buy the paper subscription to it.
Okay.
Can't recommend that enough. And you'll read a lot of stuff. There's a lot of mixed species grazing they do. A lot of stuff they do.
Is there anything else you want to talk about before we open it up for questions? Because I know
the other thing is, little people innovate. I don't care what field it is. Little guys innovate. That's even true for artificial intelligence. I was reading an article the other day in a business magazine about NVIDIA. That's the company that makes the graphics chips that power all AI systems. And the original programming structure for a neural net was made by a graduate student, where the professor suggested he do this. And they bought 2 NVIDIA video game circuit boards from Amazon and worked on the programming in his old childhood house. Little guys innovate. Because NVIDIA was too cheap to comp the chips to them, so they had to buy them. And when I typed in the number of the chip, it came right up. I can buy them on Amazon. The 2 of them, they're like $540 a piece. They might have been a little less, 2012 when they did that. But the way they did the programming, and he wrote a paper. It has over 100,000 citations. It was the basis of how AI programming is different than programming just to get movies and run the internet. But
you were saying before, because we were talking about this before we got on the call today, it's all about having the vision, right? And finding a way to...
Little people innovate, because look, the kind of things that are written up in here, I've been getting this for years. People would thought that was just alternative nonsense. And something that starts out, maybe people think it's alternative nonsense, eventually comes mainstream. Now and there is a lot of nonsense, but in every industry, the little people innovate.
Hmm.
Look at Kodak. They invented the digital camera. They went broke. They had a gigantic film plant right outside of Fort Collins, where I live. Well,
Sure.
nobody buys film anymore for anything.
All right, Temple, we're going to start looking at some questions. The first person says they'd love to hear your thoughts on interspecies grazing versus rotating species. They have goats and horses who prefer different forage, but it seems it would be easier to have them graze or browse together than to just rotate through spaces. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, some people do graze them together. You see, this is where I really recommend subscribe to the Stockman Grass Farmer and talk to other local people that are doing similar things. I cannot emphasize how local this is.
Mhm.
And go to your extension office. If there's grazing conferences, go to them. Go to beef quality assurance workshops, because that's a great place to find information on grazing. The other thing is, I'm not very pleased with the beef quality audit results. Too many buckshots and bird shot found in animals. I was just over with Libby Bigler, who's our extension person, and a local plant here sent her pictures of a shot that was found in steer meat. This is just terrible.
Really?
And the other thing is, people are using, there's one using these dart guns to vaccinate cattle. That's not okay. Because it wrecks the meat. You're gonna have to have some kind of a handling facility so you can give the shots correctly on the cattle in the neck. Give the shots where they're supposed to be given. But
Okay.
this local advice
Local
is
advice.
just so important. And
Okay.
then if I try to find somebody that can help mentor you too, local,
Okay.
and go to meetings. That's another thing I recommend, especially low meetings in your area.
Okay. Next individual says, I rotationally graze goats on a small homestead scale, about 2 acres in Massachusetts. In the spring, the rapid growth of pasture means that by the time I get the goats to the later paddocks, the grass has gone to seed and it's unpalatable. Are there any tips for managing the early spring growth to optimize available forage for my animals?
In other words, that you're rotating through and the grass gets too tall before you can rotate around.
You would need to be quicker, right?
Maybe you need a few more goats.
More animals?
And then you might have to sell them during the winter. You might need a few more of them. You
Okay.
can't, it's you might need a few more of them. You'll have 2 goats. Well, they probably just can't eat through it fast enough.
Sure. Okay. This individual says, about how long does it take a pasture to recover?
That depends. Depends upon the species of the plant. It depends upon rainfall, growth rate. It depends. So what you need to do is have your county extension agent or somebody else show you how to dig up a plant and look at root growth, because the roots grow more slowly than the green part of the plant. And it's
Especially
not fully recovered until the roots are recovered. That is a basic principle.
and if it's accidentally overgrazed, it takes even longer to regenerate because it has
Well,
to.
the problem is you can get away with maybe 2 years of not letting it recover, and then you end up just killing it.
Yeah, right.
But someone needs to show you how to dig it up and show that the roots have recovered.
Well, and then soil health comes into play, because if you don't have healthy soil, it's going to affect.
Well, that's right. And
yeah. Okay. Okay, in the context of rotational grazing, when should we consider mowing the paddocks? How do we integrate mowing as a tool in our toolkit for managing pasture in addition to the livestock?
well, and then some of that, we see what they did in the UK is they totally got away from mowing. And then since there is a dormant season, this is UK, where snow, they don't even hardly know what it is. They leave a field where the grass gets high and it kind of just dies, and they let them eat that in the wintertime.
Mm,
That's what they're doing.
sure.
They're trying to get away from feeding hay because it's so expensive to put hay up. People are trying to get away from that. Now, I'm not going to say that should be done in every situation.
I think in the beginning, there may be more of a need to mow depending on your location, depending on any noxious weeds that are coming up in your pastures.
Yeah.
If the animals aren't going to browse those, you got to get rid of them. The best way to do that is through mowing. So
well, then you may have to get rid of some of the invasive weeds.
We drop our mower blade up to 5 inches, so it's at a high point. It's not killing any of our forage, but what it is doing is knocking back those weeds enough that eventually they give up. So,
well, then there's a place for doing that. You see that
early on, yeah, in the beginning.
Or maybe you get some, like, goats will eat stuff that cattle won't touch.
Exactly. And then it
when
becomes.
I was a child, they told me they ate tin cans. Well, that's not true, but they probably eat the paper off of them.
All right. This individual would like to know, how much acreage does one sheep need or one dwarf goat?
That depends upon how it's growing. Again, good local advice. Now, a really big pasture, that one animal is going to cherry pick it. You know, as Fred Provenza says, eat the best and leave the rest. Now, I call it eat the candy and leave the celery behind.
It's true.
So if you have more pasture than one goat would eat, you might want to try rotating them too, make them.
You know, we have.
Well, I can tell you I can tell you what's not all right.
What?
Let them chew it down to like that tall.
Correct. Yeah, I agree.
That's absolutely not all right.
I think they say.
I go out in the car, a lot of times people pick me up from the airport, and then we're driving in and looking at the land and going, yeah, that one there's overgrazed. That's disgusting.
I think the rule of thumb is anything below 4 inches is considered severely overgrazed.
Yeah, that I've seen it worse than that.
Yeah.
Just chewed right down. It's still green, chewed right down to the ground. No, that's not okay.
Yeah. Yeah. So Cynthia, with regards to your question, we do have sheep here on my homestead. I'm on a 6-acre farm. I keep 5 sheep, but that is conducive to the climate that I live in and the grassy forage we have on our specific site in our microclimate. So I don't know if that.
Well, this is where I can't emphasize enough the local advice.
Yeah.
Well, I can tell you that a space the size of my kitchen here for one goat would not be sufficient.
Sure.
That would be just ridiculous, and somebody might try to do that. I see horses on little paddocks, and they've ripped all the grass out, and
yeah,
you've just ruined it.
It's not even about forage. Then it's a detriment to the land and animal health. It's just too small. Okay, Summer Potter asks how to address spring grass growing faster than you can graze it. Our flock is small and we have more grass than they can graze.
Then you may have to mow it and hay it. That's what you may have to do.
Or get more animals.
Yeah. But then you've got the problem in the wintertime feeding them. So you might have to sell some of the animals.
Sure.
Yeah, but that's all you can do.
Right.
And you want to mow it before it gets, too old.
Okay.
That's what you may have to do.
In the winter, do you only allow animals on the trash field? Oh, this must be for the sacrifice plot I would refer. Yes, in the wintertime, I only allow the animals in the sacrifice plot when the weather is wet, which is often. They are fed a sole hay diet. The only time I allow my animals to go out off the sacrifice plot is when the ground is completely frozen and their hooves aren't going to trash it, or when it starts to come back. So
that makes sense. Now, if they only get a hay diet, they're probably going to need some mineral supplements.
Oh, excuse me. Yes, they do get a vitamin and mineral supplement.
Yeah, they're going to be in trouble on minerals. They just eat hay.
Yeah, no, we do a pelleted vitamin and mineral supplement.
So then they're getting that.
Right. Okay.
The other thing is, let's look at some welfare things on the animals. What are some of your key welfare indicators? And for people who are really interested in getting into the science of animal welfare, I've got this textbook, Improving Animal Welfare, a Practical Approach. I've also got a paper on practical approach on practical application of the 5 domains: animal welfare framework, food animal supply chain management. Let's measure some things. Body condition. Are
Yes.
you maintaining body condition of your animals? And there's scoring cards you can get online, and this paper has references to scoring cards for cattle and sheep. Now the problem you got with sheep is they got wool on them. If they got a lot of big wool on them, a lot of times you can't tell that they're skinny. Lameness. Can your animals walk easily? So your welfare things would be body condition. You've got to maintain body condition. Don't let them get too skinny. Lameness. There's a lot of different things that can make them lame, but lame, sore feet hurt. Lameness hurts. Are they dirty? You don't want any of these animals just in a mud hole. The animals staying clean. They're not lame. They have decent body condition. The other thing on handling, I don't like going into a place and the sheep or the cattle run to the other end of the field because they're afraid of you.
Sure.
Now that it's also important to get livestock used to people walking through them. Getting used to people, and then lowering their flight zone, then they're going to be easier to handle.
Sure.
But I don't like going into a farm and you walk out in the field and all the animals take off. I've seen that in a dairy, and that's a sign that maybe the stockmanship wasn't that good.
Sure.
Or they just had no contact with people. The other thing is animals are very specific. Let's say you only went out with the animals in a 4-wheeler. You never got out of the vehicle. Then the flight zone might be 10 foot to the 4-wheeler, but 75 feet with you walking. Think about it. You walking is a different picture than you in a 4-wheeler.
Right.
That's a very, very different picture. So, they need to get used to a whole lot of different things. That's really important. I want to talk about another problem. This is mainly a problem with cattle. You can get very tame cattle where things can get dangerous. You go to feed them, they're mobbing you, pushing and shoving to get the hay, pushing and shoving to get the feed. And the big mistake that people make is they accidentally reward animals for pushing and shoving, and they don't realize that they've done that. And what you want to do is teach them to have some manners. And when they stand still for just a few seconds, then you put the feed down. Reward polite behavior, not pushing and shoving, because that can get dangerous. They can knock a 4-wheeler over, knock you over. The big heavy animals. You're switching pastures. You open the gate when they mob in the gate. Now you've rewarded the pushing and shoving.
Temple, what are your thoughts on the use of prescribed fire?
Yeah, I was just looking at the questions now. I had the chat up, but I didn't have the Q&A up. Prescribed burning, it depends upon where you're at. See, this again, it's very, very local. Now, the question was about chicken manure having pathogens. One of the ways you can prevent that is to compost the chicken manure. You can compost it. That will.
Oh, here's an interesting one I would like to hear your thoughts on. What's your experience with fescue and the endophyte toxin? That's the one that's in clover that causes oversalivation, correct?
Well, and that's and there's different. So you can get fescue that doesn't have the endophyte, but then the plant's not as hardy.
Yeah.
You see, this is where there's a trade-off. There's seasonal effects, and you get in parts of Missouri and things like that. There's fescue just all over the place.
We had a lot of clover here with endophytes, and the way that we got rid of it was just overseeding twice a year with our forageable cover crops that we decided to install.
Yeah.
And that kind of crowded it out. And I remember when we first moved to the property, we did have an issue with that. The horses would come in with these big drooly mouths, but through continuous rotational grazing and then also the cover crop seeding, it eradicated it. We didn't have to go pull it up by hand. It just kind of worked its way out of there. Okay.
Well, you keep saying, local advice, but these things are so localized.
Okay.
Now, one of the things that's getting a bit invasive, a real big problem in the drier parts of the world is woody invasion, junipers, these kinds of things. Oh, Arizona, I've seen disgusting 10-foot high juniper bushes. You see where the land had been grazed right, you wouldn't have all those juniper bushes. And that juniper bushes, they're fire getting. You know, the firefighters look at that and they'll look at that and go, all I see is fuel.
So piggybacking off of the question earlier, in that particular specific scenario in Arizona with the young junipers, do you think somebody should implement fire management practices with controlled burns in addition to rotational grazing, or just
Well, you have to make sure you don't let the controlled burns get out of control. Now, some of them, they just rip them out. And they call that chaining.
Mm-hmm.
And they just tear them out. They've done that.
I guess for me, any opportunity to feed my animals as opposed to pay for feed, I would opt to graze personally.
Well, that's what I would do too. And
right.
Where you have the worst problems with invasive plant, with junipers, the woody plants, is places where no ranchers are not managing that land.
Yeah.
And I've seen horrible thickets of juniper bushes. They just, you know, I lived in Arizona for 10 years. It was just terrible. And I know that in the Flint Hills, they do some prescribed burning. That's part of their program.
It is.
It is. Well, let's just look at the natural world. Fire would come through periodically, but if you let's say you block the fire for 20 years, now you've really got fuel. Then when you get a fire, it's like so hot, it just kills all the big trees. And you know, there's a place for fire. Now, I was up on the Forest Service land, and I was really concerned about all the beetle-killed trees. You've got areas of forest, I've seen it, where it's 80% dead trees.
Yeah.
Well, you get a fire in that. And then you have other forest where maybe it's 10% dead trees. Those need to be cut, pulled out, and you know, it needs to be managed.
So
I couldn't believe it. I saw some of this land, 80% dead trees in it. I mean, completely gray dead. There wasn't any green things on them. You had a fire there.
Absolutely.
That is just going to be the worst. And we had during COVID, we had a fire, and I had ash coming down on my house. And at 1 o'clock in the afternoon, the sky was red like something hideous out of a movie. And I'd go out and watch ash come down. There's a metal transformer box right in front of my house, and this with a light green surface, and I'd brush it off, and then I'd watch the ash go on there. Oh, yuck. Yeah, my porch has like rough fake wood steps, so it's harder to see it, but I can see it on that transformer box, and I'm like, I hope there's not any. It was scary. I was actually looking, there's a reservoir between where I live and the fire. I was looking up on Google Maps, Google Earth, to look at where the fire was.
Yeah.
And I even have on my refrigerator now the things I'd grab in 5 minutes.
Oh, you have a list on your refrigerator?
I have it on my refrigerator door. And I went out and I looked at that red sky. This was during COVID, the summer. I have a list on my door. It's still there.
That's scary. All right, I want to ask you one more question because we are going to get cut off sharply at 12, so we have 5 minutes. And I think silvopastures are gaining popularity. They're gaining some traction. Matthew asks, what are your thoughts about incorporating silvopasture with rotational grazing systems?
Well, some people are doing that very successfully. They're really into that in Brazil. And it's being done successfully. You know, there's a lot of different things that you can do. You know, a lot of silvopasture systems start out where there's already a bunch of big trees.
Yeah.
You start out there.
And some people start it by having pigs go through and clear.
Okay.
I've seen some people do that, but I think that kind of piggybacks off what you were just talking about. You got to clear the dead growth. Obviously, under woody growth has to go.
Well, you've got to get that out of there. I mean, I just was horrified. This is up by Steamboat Spring. This is just this summer I was up there. I was with Vents that makes the virtual fence.
Yeah.
And I want to see this technology work.
Sure.
And I want to see it work.
Sure.
And I cannot emphasize enough the training of the animals. You're not going to get phone apps and move cattle around. You might eventually be able to do that, but that might take you 6 months to train them to do that. Right?
Sure.
And I was horrified when I read that on the web page. I said, that needs to go away. The other thing on a new technology with something like virtual fencing, anything that's new, it's really important that early adopters don't fail, and that the early adopters are really enthusiastic and want to make something new work. That's really, really important.
Sure.
You know, and I was talking to Vince, I said, you know, and I went to some of the ranches that were, you know, doing it, and they want to make it work. And one of the reasons why the Forest Service got interested in it is to keep cows out of riparian areas. And they've learned some things. You don't put the virtual fence up right there next to yummy grass. You
Absolutely.
put it further back from the riparian area, so they don't just have yummy grass staring them in the face.
Right. It's going to push
So you
through.
get some animals that learn they can run through it.
Temple, can you just real quick remind folks of the name of your paper?
Oh, the grass farmer?
Not the grass farmer, the one
Oh,
that
the
you
grass, okay, the paper.
Yeah.
The paper on grazing, it is grazing. I'll hold it up again. I'll hold it up here to the screen again. Now, is that readable to you?
Yes, I can see it. Okay.
Grazing cattle, sheep, and goats is an important part of a sustainable agricultural future. Raising cattle, sheep, and goats is an important part of a sustainable agricultural future. That's my paper.
Okay. So what I will do is, folks, I will be taking this recording and I will put it up on YouTube. I'll also send out in an email newsletter a link to that recording so you can view this again, but I'll also include the link to Temple's paper that she just mentioned. And then in my book, The Sustainable Homestead, that Temple was kind enough to write the foreword for, I've got a lot on rotational grazing in there, cover crops, and then also ways to split up your pasture. Obviously, water is essential because
well, yes, obviously.
Yeah, you can't just stick an animal in a section and not give them access to water. You actually have to think about how you're going to move water troughs, if not just keep your water trough in place as the epicenter and then divide off from there. So there's some diagrams and information on that in there. I think that concludes our discussion today, though. Is there anything
Well,
else?
that sounds great. And I do have this other paper, Practical Applications of the 5 Domains Animal Welfare Framework. And even though that's aimed at big operations, there's references in there to very good scoring tools. A lot of them are free access, good scoring tools, videos for scoring lameness, pictures of body condition of animals.
Okay.
Most of them are open access and free, and there's a few that are not. I only put those in there because they were really good ones. But there's charts in there of references to scoring tools.
Okay.
For your very, very basic animal welfare.
Okay.
Body condition, lameness, dirtiness, sores and lesions.
Okay, that's good information. All right, Temple, I want to thank you so much for joining me today in this conversation. I hope folks learned something about rotational grazing. It's always a pleasure to chat with you. Thank you for
Great
being
to chat with you. It was wonderful to be here.
All right, thank you so much.
Thank you. I'm going to leave the meeting, and thank you for having me.
Absolutely. All right, bye.
Okay,
everyone.
great. Yeah, bye.
Bye.